Orleans at night carries an air of mystery. The cobblestone streets, the dim glow of streetlights reflecting off wet pavement after an evening rain, create an atmosphere both enchanting and foreboding. In the heart of the city, bars and restaurants remain lively, the sounds of jazz music echoing through every corner. But beneath this dazzling facade lies a world riddled with conspiracies, corruption, and those who abuse their power to conceal their crime. Naomi Carter, a 27-year-old investigative journalist, drove her silver sedan through the dimly lit streets, her sharp eyes scanning every figure along the sidewalks. Having previously worked for the New York Times, Naomi was no stranger to stories of a rotten justice system, but this time she wasn't just searching for the truth. She was fighting for her own survival. A few months ago, Naomi received an anonymous tip in her inbox. It was a collection of classified documents exposing a web of corruption within the New Orleans police force. At the center of it all was Inspector Thomas Grayson, a high-ranking officer known for his so-called reform efforts. In reality, he was the mastermind behind numerous staged cases, wrongful arrests, and extortion schemes targeting innocent citizens. Alongside Grayson was Officer Logan Price, his loyal enforcer and right-hand man. Price not only orchestrated fabricated arrests, but also manipulated evidence to protect their operation. Dozens of people had been imprisoned for crimes they never committed. The documents in Naomi's possession contained forged reports, doctored recordings, and coerced confessions, all undeniable proof of the corruption within the force. Naomi knew that if she exposed this evidence, she would dismantle Grayson's entire network. But doing so meant putting herself directly in the crosshairs of powerful men who would stop at nothing to keep their secrets buried. For weeks she had meticulously gathered and verified information. She met with whistleblowers, victims of the corrupt system, and even broke into an abandoned warehouse, where she uncovered hidden documents. With everything now in place, she planned to publish the evidence through an independent news outlet, avoiding censorship from major publications. Tonight, Naomi had arranged to meet Caleb Johnson, a former officer who once served under Grayson but later quit, unable to stomach the corruption. Caleb possessed critical information about a case in which Grayson had fabricated evidence to imprison an innocent man. If Naomi could obtain his testimony, it would be the final blow to Grayson's credibility. Their meeting took place in a small cafe tucked away in the depths of the French Quarter. Caleb arrived late, looking tense, his eyes darting around as if he feared being followed. He slid a USB drive across the table to Naomi and whispered, "Inside you'll find a list of fabricated cases from the past 3 years. I have to leave now. You should get out of New Orleans before it's too late." Naomi frowned. She was no stranger to danger, but the worry in Caleb's eyes unsettled her. Just as he stood up to leave, Naomi's phone vibrated. A message from an unknown number flashed across the screen. "We know what you're doing. Do you really think you can go against us?" Naomi stared at the screen, a cold chill creeping down her spine. She knew her time was running out. Her car turned onto a narrow street leading back to her apartment. The city was quiet this late at night, the empty roads bathed in the faint glow of streetlights reflecting off the damp pavement. She kept her composure, checking her rearview mirror repeatedly to make sure she wasn't being followed. Just a few blocks away from home, flashing red and blue lights suddenly illuminated the darkness behind her. A piercing siren followed. Naomi bit her lip, gripping the steering wheel tightly. A patrol car was right on her tail. Her heart pounded as she caught sight of the names on the officers' badges when they approached. Officer Logan Price and Jordan Miller. "Stay calm, Naomi," she reminded herself, taking a deep breath before rolling down her window. Price stepped closer, leaning down to peer into the car, his eyes gleaming with amusement. He shined a flashlight directly into her face, his voice dripping with mock concern. "Good evening, Miss Carter. Do you know what traffic violation you just committed?" Naomi tightened her grip on the wheel and kept her tone steady. "No, officer. I wasn't speeding or running a red light." Price smirked, exchanging a glance with Miller, as if savoring the moment. "Oh no, you failed to use your turn signal when changing lanes. That's a serious offense, and we need to inspect your vehicle." Naomi instantly understood. This wasn't a routine stop. She was being set up. I do not consent to a search of my car without a warrant, she stated firmly. Miller chuckled, shaking his head. We don't need a warrant if we have reasonable suspicion, and we just saw a small package fall out of your trunk. Naomi's eyes widened. She glanced at her rearview mirror and felt her stomach drop. Miller crouched down, then straightened, holding up a small white bag with a triumphant look on his face. Price folded his arms, tilting his head as he studied Naomi. Got anything to say, Journalist Carter? Naomi felt the blood in her veins turn to ice. This was how they operated, fabricating evidence, cutting off every escape route for their victims. Miller yanked open the car door, grabbing Naomi's arm roughly and pulling her out. You are under arrest for possession and illegal transportation of narcotics. Naomi didn't resist. She knew that if she fought back, they would have an excuse to use force. But when Price tightened the handcuffs around her wrists, he leaned in and whispered in her ear. This is a lesson for people who like to stick their noses where they don't belong. Hope you enjoy prison life. Naomi took a deep breath, steadying herself. She refused to let her body tremble. Instead, she locked eyes with him, her gaze burning not with fear but with rage. This game isn't over, Price. I will expose all of you. They shoved her into the patrol car, the sirens wailing once again, echoing through the empty streets. The doors slammed shut, and Naomi knew. Her real battle was only just beginning. Inside the cramped back seat of the patrol car, the flashing red and blue lights reflected off her face. Her hands were tightly cuffed behind her, the metal biting into her wrists. Outside, Officer Logan Price stood with Jordan Miller, exchanging smug glances and mocking smiles. The car started moving, taking her toward the New Orleans Police Department. Tonight, Naomi wasn't just being arrested. She was about to face the darkest moments of her life. The police station was housed in an old, worn-down building. The flickering fluorescent lights inside gave the place an eerie, lifeless atmosphere. As soon as the car stopped, Naomi was dragged out roughly. She stumbled as Miller shoved her forward, nearly making her fall. "Move it, troublemaker," Miller sneered. Inside the station, several officers sat around the front desk, none of them paying attention to what was happening. They were used to scenes like this. People arrested, locked away, and forgotten. Some officers gave Naomi a curious glance, but no one intervened. Price grabbed Naomi's arm and yanked her upright. "We have to process you before you go into your cell," he said, his voice laced with amusement. "But first, let's see what we've got here." Naomi bit her lip, suppressing her fury. She knew that whatever was about to happen, it wouldn't be just standard procedure. She was taken to a small room with an old wooden table and a row of metal lockers. Sitting across from her was Officer Rebecca Hayes, the female officer in charge of processing and fingerprinting detainees. But instead of following protocol, Hayes seemed more interested in humiliating Naomi. "Take off your coat," Hayes ordered. Naomi glanced around. The room had no cameras, and outside the door Miller stood with his arms crossed, leaning against the frame with a smug grin. "This is standard procedure," Hayes continued. "We need to make sure you're not hiding anything dangerous." Naomi knew this was just an excuse. They didn't need to search her this way, but they were enjoying the control. They wanted to make her feel powerless, to reduce her to nothing more than a victim. She took a deep breath, suppressing her rage, then slowly removed her coat. "Keep going," Hayes ordered. Naomi clenched her teeth. She knew that if she resisted, they would have an excuse to use force. Reluctantly, she unbuttoned her shirt, left in only her undershirt. From the doorway, Price let out a low whistle. "Not bad," he sneered. Miller chuckled, his eyes betraying his disgusting thoughts. Naomi felt sick. She had faced dangerous situations before, but she had never felt as degraded as she did now. Once the search was over, Hayes tossed Naomi's clothes back at her with a look of disdain. "Get dressed, but remember, your night is just getting started." After the so-called procedure, Naomi was shoved into a small interrogation room. The ceiling was low, and the flickering white light overhead cast an oppressive atmosphere. She was strapped tightly to a chair, her wrists still aching from the metal cuffs. Price and Miller entered, shutting the door behind them. They carried no files, no paperwork. This was not an official interrogation. "You think you're smart, don't you, Carter?" Price said, his tone colder than before. "You really thought you could expose us and walk away unscathed?" Naomi remained silent, her gaze locked onto his, unflinching. "Do you know what happened to the last person who tried to take us down?" Miller added. "He's 6 feet underground now." Price stepped closer, grabbing Naomi's chin, forcing her to look directly into his eyes. "We can make you disappear. No one will find you. No one will even remember you." Naomi tightened her fists, refusing to let fear take hold. "If you kill me, I guarantee that everything I have on you is already out there," she said, her voice unwavering, full of defiance. Price laughed, but his eyes darkened. "Then maybe we don't have to kill you right away, but we can make you beg for death." The first punch landed hard against her stomach. Naomi doubled over in pain, her breath caught in her throat, but she didn't scream. She wouldn't give them that satisfaction. Miller clapped his hands slowly. "Tough, huh? Let's see how long that lasts." He grabbed her hair, yanking her head back, then drove a brutal punch into her left cheek. Naomi's head snapped to the side, the metallic taste of blood filling her mouth. A sharp wave of pain spread across her face, but she still didn't make a sound. The next blow came from Price. Naomi felt like her ribs were about to crack. She took a shaky breath, forcing herself to stay conscious. The beating went on for nearly 20 minutes. By the time they stopped, Naomi had collapsed forward, her body so battered and numb that she could barely feel the pain anymore. But inside her, a fire still burned, the fire of defiance. As soon as Price and Miller left the room, the door creaked open quietly. A figure stepped inside. It was Officer David Torres, a young cop recently assigned to the New Orleans precinct. His face was tense with concern as he took in the sight of Naomi's condition. "I know you don't deserve this," he murmured, "and I won't let them hurt you anymore." Naomi looked up, her eyes filled with suspicion. She didn't know if she could trust him. Torres moved closer, unlocking the cuffs around her wrists. "We don't have much time," he whispered. "I've seen your file, and I know you're telling the truth. I can help you get out of here." Naomi gripped his arm, using what little strength she had left to pull herself up. "Then help me, and we'll take them all down." Torres nodded, determination burning in his eyes. Tonight, a new alliance was formed, and Naomi had just found her one chance to bring down the men who had imprisoned her. The cold interrogation room was now silent, save for Naomi's unsteady breaths. She sat there, bruises deepening on her skin, pain radiating through every inch of her body. But even in the silence, she knew one thing for certain. The real fight had only just begun. But what enraged her the most wasn't the punches or the insults, it was the helplessness. The very people who were supposed to uphold justice were abusing their power to cover up their crimes, turning her into a pawn to be beaten down and discarded. Her eyes scanned the small room, searching for any opportunity to escape. But there were no windows, no phone, and no one outside who could hear her cries for help. Suddenly, footsteps echoed down the hallway. Naomi lifted her head, her eyes sharp with caution. The door creaked open, and a man stepped inside. It was Officer David Torres, a young cop recently transferred to the New Orleans precinct. He wasn't as tall or broad as Price or Miller, but there was something different about him, a seriousness in his expression that set him apart from the men who had tortured her. His eyes were filled with hesitation, but not with scorn or sadistic pleasure. He quietly shut the door behind him, quickly glancing down the hallway before turning back to Naomi. "You don't deserve this," he murmured, his voice low and tense. Naomi narrowed her eyes, unsure if she could believe what she was hearing. "Then why are you here?" she asked, her voice hoarse from the pain. Torres stared at her for a few seconds, as if battling an internal conflict. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small key. "I'm getting you out of here." Naomi exhaled sharply, her heart pounding in her chest. "Why?" she asked. "Do you even realize what they'll do to you if they find out?" Torres clenched his jaw, his eyes flashing with long-suppressed anger. "I've seen enough," he said. I've stayed silent for too long." He knelt beside her, unlocking the handcuffs. As the metal restraints fell to the floor with a soft clink, Naomi felt the first flicker of hope in what had been a relentless nightmare. She looked at Torres, trying to decipher who he really was. "You're not like them," she said. Torres let out a small, bitter smile. "I was never supposed to be like them," he sighed, "but I kept quiet out of fear." Naomi rubbed her wrists, the red marks from the cuffs still burning against her skin. Then she met his gaze and nodded. "Then do the right thing now." Torres gave a firm nod. "We have to get out of here before Price comes back." Torres opened the door and led Naomi out of the interrogation room. They moved quickly but silently through the hallway. As they passed by, Naomi saw other officers, some sitting at their desks, others laughing and chatting. None of them seemed to notice that she had been brutally beaten just moments ago. "Do they really not care about what happens here?" she whispered. Torres clenched his fists. "Most of them just look the other way," he said. "They don't want to get involved." Naomi gritted her teeth. That was the painful truth about the system. So many people knew what was happening, yet they chose silence to protect themselves. They neared the exit, but just then, a voice called out from behind them. "Torres, what are you doing?" Naomi froze. Torres turned to face Officer Eric Matthews, a longtime colleague at the precinct. Matthews looked at Naomi, then back at Torres. Suspicion grew in his eyes. "You're helping her?" he asked, disbelief in his voice. Torres stood tall, keeping his composure. "She doesn't deserve this," he said, "and you know it." Matthews remained silent for a long moment. Then he exhaled heavily, stepping back. "Go," he muttered, "before I change my mind." Naomi stared at Matthews, trying to figure out if he was playing a game. But his expression wasn't hostile, just weary, the look of a man who had seen too many wrongs but lacked the courage to stop them. Torres grabbed Naomi's arm. "Move, now." They rushed through the back door, stepping into the cool night air. Naomi and Torres darted into a dark alley behind the police station. They couldn't stop, couldn't hesitate. Naomi panted heavily, but she knew that simply escaping wasn't enough. "We need evidence," she said. "If I just disappear, they'll keep doing this to other people." Torres frowned. "What do you mean?" Naomi pulled a small USB drive from her pocket. "I planted a secret recording device in my coat before I was arrested," she said. "Everything Price and Miller said to me, it's all recorded." Torres' eyes widened. "Are you serious?" Naomi nodded. "But I need to get it somewhere safe. If they find me first, none of this will matter." Torres thought for a moment, then pulled out his phone. "I know someone who can help," he said. "We'll get this evidence to the press." Naomi looked at him, then nodded. "Then let's go." Not long after, Price discovered Naomi was gone. He roared in fury, grabbing a chair and hurling it against the wall. "Find her immediately," he shouted at the other officers. But it was too late. The next morning, the New Orleans Times published a front-page exposé. Inside were all the details of Price and Miller's abuses, the wrongful arrests, the torture, the corruption, video evidence, audio recordings. Everything was undeniable. The FBI launched an investigation. A full-scale crackdown began. Price and Miller were arrested right inside their own precinct. Outside the station, Naomi watched as the men who once believed they were untouchable were now being led away in handcuffs. Torres stood beside her, exhaling in relief. "You did it," he said. Naomi looked up at the clear blue sky, feeling truly free for the first time in days. "No," she said. "We did it." The battle was over, but the fight for justice was far from finished. Naomi Carter stood by the window of her small apartment, gazing down at the bustling streets of New Orleans. It had been 3 days since she and Officer Torres escaped from that hellish police station. In her possession was the USB drive containing undeniable evidence of Lieutenant Price and Officer Miller's abuses of power. But she knew that keeping it to herself would mean the truth would never see the light of day. Torres sat on a chair, his phone in hand, checking his messages constantly. His face was tense. The police are still hunting for you, he said, setting his phone down on the table. They're painting you as a criminal, a dangerous fugitive. The media still doesn't know what really happened. Naomi took a deep breath. It wasn't surprising. Those in power always found ways to manipulate the truth. We need a plan, she said. If we don't act fast, this will all be buried, and those bastards will keep getting away with it. Torres nodded. I reached out to an investigative journalist named Emily Novak, he said. She's exposed police corruption before. If anyone can help us bring this to light, it's her. Naomi considered it for a moment, then nodded. Then let's meet her. Torres shook his head. It won't be that easy. Price's men probably have eyes everywhere. We can't just walk into a newsroom. Emily has arranged a secret meeting spot. Naomi clenched her fists. She had come too far to turn back now. Then let's go. Under the cover of night, Naomi and Torres slipped out of the apartment, weaving through dark alleys to avoid being seen. Tension hung thick in the air. They both knew that if they were caught, they might never get another chance to expose the truth. They climbed into an old car that Torres had prepared. Their destination, an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city, where Emily Novak was waiting for them. The streets were quiet at this hour, but the feeling of being watched never left Naomi's mind. She checked the rearview mirror, scanning for any signs that they were being followed. Are we being followed? She asked. Torres squinted into the rearview mirror, then shook his head. I'm not sure, but it's best not to stop. They continued driving in silence, every turn a test of their nerves, but as they neared the meeting point just a few blocks away, Naomi felt a sudden unease. A black SUV appeared behind them out of nowhere. Everything happened too fast. The unknown vehicle sped up, deliberately swerving to force Torres off the road. Shit, Torres cursed, gripping the steering wheel tightly. Naomi turned around, her heart pounding as she spotted two men in black suits inside the SUV. One of them was pulling out a gun. They know we're here, she shouted. Torres gritted his teeth and slammed the gas pedal. Their car shot forward, but the SUV accelerated to match, refusing to let them escape. The first gunshot rang out, shattering the rear windshield. Naomi ducked, her pulse racing. We have to lose them, she yelled. Torres veered sharply into a narrow alley, the tires screeching against the pavement, narrowly missing a dumpster. But the SUV followed closely, its headlights flooding the alley with light. Naomi gasped for breath, then suddenly had an idea. Turn into that parking lot on the right, she instructed. Torres didn't hesitate. He yanked the wheel and sped into an abandoned parking lot. The SUV followed, right into the trap. As soon as they rounded a blind corner, Naomi threw open the door and rolled out of the car. Torres kept driving, using the vehicle as a decoy. She hit the ground hard, pain jolting through her body, but there was no time to stop. Naomi ducked behind an old rusted car, holding her breath as the SUV roared past, its drivers unaware she was no longer inside. Still locked on Torres, the vehicle sped after him. She waited a few seconds, then took off running. She had to reach the meeting point. Naomi nearly collapsed as she reached the abandoned warehouse. She was gasping for air, her clothes stained with dirt, her knees scraped and bleeding, but none of it mattered. She was still alive. Emily Novak was already waiting, a sharp-eyed woman with chestnut-brown hair dressed in a long coat, her expression a mix of curiosity and determination. You're late, Emily said. I thought you weren't going to make it. Naomi let out a dry laugh. I almost didn't. Without hesitation, she pulled out the USB drive and handed it to Emily. Everything you need is in here, Naomi said. The recordings, the videos, the falsified reports, all the proof of how Price and Miller manipulated the system. Emily stared at the USB drive as if it were the most valuable thing in the world. If this is real, she said slowly, this will be the biggest police scandal in years. Naomi nodded. And you can do the right thing with it. Emily said nothing else. She slipped the USB into her coat pocket and pulled out her phone. We need to get this out to the public immediately. And within just a few hours, New Orleans was shaken by an unprecedented scandal. The files were released, the recordings aired on national television, and the surveillance footage exposed Price and Miller's crimes for all to see. The entire city knew the truth. The FBI wasted no time. Price and Miller were suspended and arrested within 24 hours. The investigation expanded, revealing a web of corruption that implicated numerous other officers. Naomi stood outside FBI headquarters, her eyes fixed on the clear blue sky. Torres stepped up beside her, gazing upward as if trying to savor a rare moment of peace. "You did it," he said. Naomi shook her head. "We did it." She turned to Torres, her eyes filled with gratitude. Without him, she might not have lived to see justice served. Torres gave her a small smile. "So, what's next? For you?" Naomi took a deep breath, then smiled. "Move forward," she said. "There's still so much that needs to change." With steady steps, she walked away, leaving behind the painful past, but never forgetting the lessons it had taught her. The New Orleans sky was clear that day, sunlight casting its glow over the city, but inside the packed courtroom the atmosphere was suffocating with tension. Naomi Carter sat in the front row, her sharp gaze locked onto the trial unfolding before her. At the defendant's stand, Lieutenant Richard Price and Officer Daniel Miller stood, their faces pale, their eyes clouded with despair. These were the same men who once wielded their power with arrogance, oppressing others at will, but now they stood as nothing more than desperate men awaiting their fate. Judge William Foster looked down at the documents before him. His face was stern, but his presence carried the gravitas of a man delivering justice. His voice was steady as he spoke. "The jury has reached a verdict. Defendants Richard Price and Daniel Miller have been found guilty on all charges, including abuse of power, fabricating evidence, assaulting detainees, and obstruction of justice." The courtroom erupted. Some clapped, others sighed in relief. Naomi, however, remained stoic. She knew this verdict was just the beginning, a first step in a much larger fight to reform the system that Price and Miller had exploited for years. Judge Foster continued, his voice echoing across the chamber. "The court hereby sentences Richard Price to 30 years in prison, with no possibility of parole. Daniel Miller is sentenced to 25 years in prison." Price's jaw dropped, his eyes darting wildly, as if he still couldn't believe this day had come. Miller, on the other hand, hung his head, his face hollow, his shoulders trembling. The once powerful officers who believed they stood above the law were now prisoners of the very system they had abused. Naomi watched them, her face unreadable, her heart unmoved. This was not revenge. This was justice. Shortly after the trial concluded, New Orleans was rocked by a wave of investigations targeting the city's police department. News outlets, television stations, and social media exploded with coverage of what was being called the largest police scandal in Louisiana's history. The FBI launched a full-scale review, uncovering deep-rooted corruption beyond Price and Miller.
It wasn't just two officers. It was an entire system that had enabled them. Over a dozen high-ranking officers were fired, with several facing criminal charges for their roles in wrongful arrests, excessive force, and cover-ups. The police chief of New Orleans was forced to resign, making way for a new leader, someone with integrity and a commitment to real reform. New regulations were put in place, including mandatory body cameras for officers and an improved internal oversight system to prevent future abuses. The cases fabricated by Price and Miller were reopened, leading to dozens of wrongfully convicted individuals being freed. Their lives, once stolen, were finally restored. Naomi met some of them, witnessing the tears of joy on their families' faces. It was in those moments that she realized her fight had never been just for herself. It was for those who never had the chance to speak out. As for Officer Miguel Torres, his role in exposing the truth led to a promotion. Despite facing backlash from former colleagues, he stood firm, becoming a symbol of integrity within law enforcement. And Naomi, she never stopped. Naomi sat in a small cafe by the Mississippi River, quietly watching the water flow. A year had passed since her case shook the entire city, but she still couldn't rest. On the table before her lay a new file, a new case, a new name, another injustice. This time it was about a 16-year-old boy brutally beaten by police and falsely accused. Don't you ever get tired? A familiar voice broke through her thoughts. Naomi looked up to see Emily Novak standing there with her signature half smirk. I can't stop, Naomi replied with a shrug. Emily pulled out a chair, setting her coffee down on the table. You don't have to carry all of this alone, Naomi, she said, her voice softer now. You've done enough. Naomi stared at the file in front of her, her fingers gliding over the pages filled with details of yet another life crushed by the system. Justice doesn't just happen, she said. It has to be fought for. Emily sighed, but she understood. Naomi wasn't just fighting for justice. She was fighting for herself, for everything she had lost, for everything she had endured. She couldn't turn her back on the truth. She couldn't ignore the voices crying out for help. No matter how brutal the battle, Naomi knew she couldn't stop. Because once the light of truth has been ignited, it can never be extinguished.